If you're watching this at 2 a.m. because you can't sleep, feeling completely alone, even though you prayed tonight, even though you believe, even though you've been faithful for decades, I need you to know something. You're not the only one. There's a loneliness that comes after 50 that no one talks about in church. It's not the sharp ache of youth or the desperate searching of your 30s. This is quieter, more civilized. The kind of loneliness that sits in the third row every Sunday, smiles at coffee hour, volunteers for everything, and goes home to a silence so complete it feels like drowning. What if I told you there are women in your own congregation who are dying of the same isolation? What if the answer isn't more prayer, more faith, more trying harder, but something as simple and revolutionary as showing up at someone's kitchen table at 5 a.m. and telling the truth? This is the story of Linda, 59, divorced, invisible, at her own church for 8 years. It's the story of Margaret, Dorothy, Susan, and ultimately 43 women who discovered that soul flowing isn't about having stronger faith, about admitting that faithful women can be desperately lonely, and that the answer isn't more God but more honest people who need God together. Linda Grace Mitchell pressed her fingertips against the worn hymnal, feeling the slight indentations where countless hands had gripped these same pages. Around her, 200 voices lifted in harmony, yet the sound seemed to pass through her like she was made of mist. She knew every face in this sanctuary. 12 years of Sundays had taught her their names, their children's graduations, their prayer requests. She could predict who would cry during communion, who would slip out early, who would linger for coffee. But knowing faces wasn't the same as being known. The loneliness had a particular quality after 59 years of living. It wasn't the sharp ache of youth or the desperate hunger of early adulthood. This loneliness was quieter, more civilized. It wore pearls and smiled at pop. It volunteered for the prayer chain while dying inside, for someone to truly pray with her, not just for her. "Peace be with you," the pastor announced, and Linda turned to shake hands with the couple behind her. Their grip was warm, their smiles genuine. But in 4 seconds it would be over and she'd turn forward again, alone with God in a room full of believers. That's what no one talked about. How you could love Jesus with your whole heart and still feel cosmically isolated. How you could attend every service, join every Bible study, serve on 3 committees, and still go home to a silence so complete it felt like drowning. The church spoke often about the loneliness of the world, but what about the loneliness within the church itself? Linda watched the morning light stream through stained glass, painting rainbow fragments across empty spaces between bodies. Beautiful light, but still just light passing through. She thought about Christ in Gethsemane, surrounded by disciples who couldn't stay awake for his darkest hour. Even the Son of God knew this particular breed of spiritual loneliness. Her phone vibrated silently in her purse, probably another group text about the women's luncheon she'd attend and smile through. She'd mastered the performance of connection, could play the part of the engaged church member. But performance was exhausting when what you craved was presence. What if faith itself had become her cage? The fellowship hall smelled of weak coffee and store-bought cookies. That particular blend of artificial vanilla and institutional carpet that Linda had come to associate with forced conversation. She stood at the edge of the room, paper cup warming her palms, watching clusters of people form and reform like cells under a microscope. "Linda, how are you, dear?" Barbara Thompson approached with that specific church lady energy, part genuine care, part social obligation. They'd had this same exchange for 5 years now, never moving past the surface pleasantries. "Blessed," Linda responded automatically, the expected answer that revealed nothing. She could have said she'd eaten cereal for dinner 3 nights this week, because cooking for one felt pointless. Could have mentioned the 2 a.m. panic that gripped her chest when she calculated how many Sundays she might have left. But blessed was safer. Barbara nodded, already scanning the room for her next interaction. "Wonderful. See you at the luncheon Tuesday," and she was gone before Linda could respond, leaving only the faint scent of White Shoulders perfume. This was the mathematics of church socializing. 30 seconds per person, multiply by 20 interactions, equals 10 minutes of connection that somehow added up to 0. Linda had become fluent in this language of proximity without intimacy. This careful choreography of being together while remaining apart. She watched the younger mothers cluster near the children's wing, exhausted but bonded by their shared chaos. The widows gathered by the memorial wall, their grief a membership card to an exclusive club. The married couples stood in synchronized pairs, finishing each other's sentences. Everyone had their tribe except those who fell through the demographic cracks. 59, divorced, childless, by circumstance, not choiceware, was her designated corner. She was too young for the widows, too old for the young professionals, too single for the married groups, too unencumbered for the mothers. She existed in the spaces between categories, invisible unless someone needed volunteer hours filled. Linda drifted toward the exit, nodding and smiling at familiar faces who nodded and smiled back. A pantomime of belonging that fooled everyone, including, sometimes, herself. Her hand was on the door handle when she felt resistance in her purse or Bible had caught on something. She pulled it free and noticed a small piece of paper flutter to the floor. Not a bulletin or offering envelope, but a handwritten note on pale blue stationery. Linda's heart stuttered as she unfolded it, glancing around to see if anyone was watching. The handwriting was careful, deliberate. If you're tired of pretending you're not drowning, meet me at the prayer garden bench tomorrow at 4:52 a.m. Come as you are, especially the parts you hide. You're not the only one. Linda turned the note over in her fingers for the 100th time that evening. The blue paper had softened from handling, the mysterious words memorized but still puzzling. She sat in her living room, surrounded by the artifacts of a faithful life, devotional books arranged on shelves, a prayer journal half filled with requests for others, a cross-stitch of Philippians 4:30 her mother had made. All evidence of belief, none of companionship. Her prayer life had become a monologue delivered to the ceiling each night. Lord, she'd begin, then pour out words into the darkness, hoping they reached heaven but never quite sure. She prayed for the sick, the lost, the broken, everyone except herself, because admitting her own spiritual loneliness felt like betraying God's sufficiency. But wasn't God sufficient? The question haunted her as she prepared her simple dinner. If Christ was enough, why did this ache persist? She'd been taught that Jesus filled every void, that his presence was better than any human relationship. Yet here she sat, Bible opened on her lap, feeling like she was slowly suffocating under the weight of private faith. The theological truth was sound, she knew that. But theology and experience had diverged somewhere around year 50 when the last of her church friends moved away, and she realized she had no one to call when her mammogram came back suspicious. She'd sat in that waiting room alone, praying alone, receiving good news alone, celebrating alone. God was there, yes, but God didn't bring casseroles or offer a shoulder to cry on. Her faith had become heavy precisely because she carried it alone. Every doubt, every question, every moment of spiritual dryness, she bore them in isolation, terrified that admitting struggle would mark her as insufficiently spiritual. So she performed strength while crumbling inside, quoted scripture while questioning everything, smiled through services while her soul scraped against itself like dry bones. The prayer journal mocked her from the coffee table. Last entry, 2 weeks ago, a grocery list of intercession for people who had no idea she existed beyond her volunteer duties. When had she stopped writing her own heart? When had her relationship with God become so formal, so careful, so utterly disconnected from her actual life? Linda looked at the clock. 10:17 p.m. In 6.5 hours, she could discover who had seen through her performance. Someone else knew the weight of private faith. Someone else was drowning in plain sight. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. The text appeared. Set your alarm for 4:30. Trust the invitation. You've carried this alone long enough. Linda couldn't sleep. The blue note lay on her nightstand next to her phone, which showed 2:47 a.m. in unforgiving digital clarity. She'd given up pretending to rest and instead sat at her kitchen table with her Bible, searching for something she'd overlooked. Genesis 2:18 stared back at her. It is not good for man to be alone. She'd always read that as romance, marriage, partnership. But what if it was bigger? What if the very first not good in all of creation was about isolation itself? Her fingers found their way to Acts, to the early church that shared everything, ate together daily, prayed in each other's homes. They didn't just attend temple. They lived intertwined lives. When had Christianity become so individual, so private, so terrifyingly alone? She thought about Moses needing Aaron to hold up his arms, Elijah running to the wilderness, suicidal with isolation until God sent him to Elijah. Even Jesus, fully God, fully sufficient, chose 12 to walk beside him, asks 3 to pray with him in his darkest hour, cried out feeling abandoned on the cross. If the Son of God needed community, what arrogance made her think she could thrive without it? The American church had somehow twisted faith into a private transaction between individual souls and God, forgetting that the Greek word for church, ekklesia, meant assembly. Not a building, not a service, but people gathered together. The Bible she'd studied for decades was written to communities full of one another, commands impossible to obey in isolation. Bear one another's burdens, confess to one another, encourage one another daily. How could she fulfill any of these sitting alone in her townhouse, maintaining her careful distance, protecting her wounded heart behind walls of pleasant Christianity? Linda traced the words with her finger, seeing them fresh. The Trinity itself was communicado, Son, Spirit, in eternal fellowship. Humans were made in that image, designed for relationship, not just with God, but with each other. Her loneliness wasn't spiritual failure. It was the natural consequence of trying to live faith in isolation. For 15 a.m. now, time to shower, dress, decide whether to trust this invitation. But the decision was already made. She couldn't carry this alone anymore. Whatever waited in that prayer garden, judgment, disappointment, or maybe, impossibly, understanding it had to be better than this beautiful, terrible solitude. She grabbed her keys, her Bible, and the blue note. Dawn was coming. The prayer garden was empty except for a woman Linda recognized, but had never truly noticed. Margaret something she sang in the choir, always alto, always in the back row. 60-ish, silver hair pulled into a loose bun, wearing jeans and a cardigan that had seen better decades. She sat on the bench like she'd been waiting forever, and just 5 minutes simultaneously. "You came," Margaret said simply, patting the space beside her. No surprise in her voice, just quiet recognition. Linda sat, clutching her Bible-like armor. "The note? I've been watching you for 2 years," Margaret interrupted gently. "The way you hold yourself apart, the way you leave immediately after service, the way you volunteer for everything but connect with no one. I recognize the pattern because I lived it for a decade after my husband died." The honesty was jarring. No small talk, no church pleasantries, just truth delivered at 4:52 a.m. in a garden where no one else could hear. "I'm not widowed," Linda started to explain, as if that disqualified her from legitimate loneliness. "Loneliness doesn't check marital status," Margaret replied. "It doesn't care if you're divorced, single, widowed, or married to someone who can't see your soul. It just is. And in church, we're all so busy pretending to be fine that we're dying inside." A bird began singing somewhere in the darkness, a tentative melody against the approaching dawn. Linda felt something crack inside her chest, not breaking, but opening, like a door sealed shut, suddenly remembering it could move. Margaret continued, 6 months ago, I started something. Not a Bible study, not a prayer group, not another program, just mornings, my kitchen table, coffee that's actually good, women who are tired of pretending. We show up HE 5 a.m. because that's when the masks are too heavy to wear. Who comes? Linda whispered. Women whose kids don't call, women whose faith feels dusty, women who've been in church 40 years and still feel like strangers, women over 50 who discovered that this season of life has its own particular wilderness. Margaret turned to face her fully. Women like us who need soul flowing more than we need another sermon about joy. Linda's breath caught. Soul flowing. That's what we've started calling it. When you stop grinding against life, against God's rhythm, against your own heart. When you let yourself flow with truth instead of forcing yourself through motions. Margaret stood, extending her hand. My house is 3 blocks away. There's fresh coffee and 3 other women who've been hoping you'd come. No agenda, no study book, just presence. The sky was lightning now, pink, threading through purple. Linda looked at the hand extended toward her, weathered, honest, steady. She took it. Margaret's kitchen smelled like real coffee and cinnamon, nothing like the institutional brew at church. 3 women sat around a farmhouse table that had seen generations of meals, their faces soft in the lamplight. Linda recognized them all: Peripheral Susan from the mission committee, Dorothy who arranged flowers, Carla who ran the food pantry. The new one, Dorothy said simply, not unkindly. We've been praying you'd find us. Linda sat in the offered chair, disoriented by the lack of pretense. No one asked how she was doing. No one rushed to fill silence. No one performed the exhausting ritual of church chat. They simply made space for her at the table. Margaret poured coffee into a mug that read "World's Okayest Human" and began without preamble. After 50, loneliness changes shape. It's not the sharp hunger of youth or the frantic searching of middle age. It becomes this quiet emptying, like watching yourself become translucent. Susan nodded, wrapping her hands around her cup. Parents gone. Kids launched. Marriage either ended or shifted into roommate status. Career winding down or done. All the roles that defined us mother, daughter, wife, professional, they're either gone or fundamentally altered. And the church, Carla added softly, treats us like we're either wise sages or invisible volunteers. Never just human women, still figuring things out. Linda felt tears threaten. These women were naming something she'd never been able to articulate: the particular isolation of being a woman past society's definition of relevance, but still decades from death. Too old to be seen, too young to be revered, suspended in a strange invisibility. The world tells us our value peaked at 35, Dorothy said. The church tells us our purpose is serving others until we die. But what about our own souls? What about the parts of us still growing, still seeking, still needing? That's why mornings matter, Margaret explained. Before the world wakes up and tells us who to be. Before the roles and responsibilities, before the performance. Just us, creation, and God in the quiet, learning to flow instead of force. I don't even know how to be real anymore, Linda admitted, surprising herself with a confession. I've been playing the part so long, I've forgotten what's underneath. That's why you're here. Susan reached across the table, not quite touching, but offering. We're all remembering together, discovering that soul flowing isn't about having answers, it's about finally being honest about the questions. The clock showed 5:24 a.m. Outside, birds were beginning their full chorus. Inside, 5 women, over 50, sat in wholly ordinary silence, no longer alone. We don't pray like church, Margaret warned gently. No kingijamis, no performance, no pretty words. Just what's true. The 5 women joined hands around the table. Linda expected someone to lead, but silence stretched instead. Not uncomfortable silence, anticipatory, like the pause before music begins. Then Dorothy spoke, eyes closed, voice rough. God, I'm angry at you about my granddaughter's cancer. I know I'm not supposed to be, but I am. She's 8. It's not fair. I'm trying to trust you, but today I mostly just want to scream. Linda's eyes flew open in shock. No one corrected Dorothy. No one rushed to comfort with platitudes. They simply held her hands tighter. Susan went next. I haven't felt you in 3 months. I show up, do the rituals, read the words, but it's like praying to drywall. If you're listening, I could use a sign that's not just my imagination. This wasn't the sanitized prayer, Linda knew. This was raw, unfiltered, dangerously honest. Her heart raced with equal parts fear and recognition. Carla's turn. My son hasn't spoken to me in 2 years. I don't even know if I did something wrong or if he just decided I'm not worth knowing. Help me stop checking my phone 40 times a day for a message that won't come. Margaret squeezed Linda's hand. Her turn, if she wanted it. The words came from somewhere deeper than Linda knew existed. I'm so lonely I sometimes forget I'm real. I smile at church and die inside. I've been a Christian for 40 years, and I don't know if I even know you anymore, or if I just know about you. I'm terrified that this is all there is. Just me, talking to myself in an empty room forever. The tears came then, hot and unexpected. Linda waited for someone to fix it, to quote scripture, to minimize her pain with spiritual band-aid. Instead, Margaret simply said, "Yes, all of that. We hear you. God hears you." "It's real," Susan added. "The loneliness, the doubt, the anger, the silence, all of it belongs here." They sat with Linda's words, letting them exist without correction or comfort. Just witness, just presence, just the revolutionary act of admitting that faithful women could feel desperately alone and desperately angry and desperately lost, all while loving God. Margaret spoke last. "Lord, we're 5 women over 50 who are tired of pretending. We're bringing you our actual selves this morning, the doubting, furious, lonely, seeking parts. We're done grinding against what's true. Teach us to flow with you, even when we can't feel you. Especially then." "Amen," they said together, but it sounded more like beginning. Linda's tears wouldn't stop. For the first time in years, she didn't try to make them. The tears lasted 12 minutes. Linda knew because she watched the clock on Margaret's wall, amazed that no one rushed her through them. No tissues thrust at her with implicit pressure to compose herself. No uncomfortable shifting or subject changes. Just for women drinking coffee while she fell apart at 5:37 a.m. When the storm passed, Linda felt emptied and somehow cleaner. "I haven't cried in front of anyone in 8 years." 8 years since the divorce?" Susan asked gently. Linda nodded, surprised they knew. "I didn't think anyone at church even noticed when Robert left." "We noticed," Dorothy said. "We watched you show up alone, sit alone, leave alone. But none of us knew how to bridge it. Church teaches us to respect privacy, give space, wait for people to ask for help. Meanwhile, we're all drowning in our separate pools." "That's what changed for me." Margaret refilled Linda's mug. "I stopped waiting for invitation and started issuing them. Started looking for the women who arrived precisely on time and left immediately after the ones who practiced at being alone. The ones whose smiles never reach their eyes." "You make us sound like some secret society," Carla laughed. "But it was warm, aren't we?" Susan challenged. "The society of women who stopped pretending, the underground railroad for spiritual loneliness." Linda felt something shift in her chest, a door, not just opening, but coming off its hinges entirely. "I spent so long protecting myself from judgment that I protected myself from everything, from everyone. The walls we build to keep pain out also keep life out," Dorothy observed. "I learned that after Tom died. Grief was my fortress for 3 years, until Margaret literally showed up at my door with soup and stubbornness. 4:45 a.m. soup. Margaret, because grief doesn't sleep normal hours." They shared stories then, each woman mapping her journey from isolation to this table. Susan's husband had dementia, physically present but gone. Carla's faith crisis after her ministry dreams died. Dorothy's descent into complicated grief. Margaret's decade of widowed invisibility. "We all had different locks," Margaret summarized, "but loneliness was the master key, and soul flowing." This practice of mourning honesty, of flowing with what's real instead of forcing what should be, it's what taught us to unlock from the inside. "How?" Linda asked. "How do you go from locked to this?" "You say yes to the next real thing," Susan answered. "Yes to tears. Yes to anger. Yes to showing up messy. Yes to 5 a.m. when your masks are too tired to work. Yes to women who see through your performance because they've performed the same show." Margaret looked at Linda directly. "You already said yes by coming here. The question is, will you say yes tomorrow?" Linda thought about her empty townhouse, her scripted prayers, her suffocating performance of faith. Then she looked at these 4 Susan masked, unafraid, unbearably kind. "What time?" "Same bat time." Dorothy grinned. "Same holy kitchen." 3 weeks of mornings. 21 sunrises around Margaret's table. Linda had developed a rhythm. For 30 alarm, for 45 departure, for 55 arrival, to help Margaret with coffee. 5 o'clock sharp, when souls started flowing. The early hour mattered more than she'd expected. At 5 a.m., the world hadn't started demanding yet. No emails, no obligations, no performance requirements, just a sacred threshold between night and day when truth felt safer to speak. I used to dread mornings, Linda admitted on day 2. They meant facing another day of pretending. Now I wake up at 4:15 without an alarm. Your soul knows when it's feeding time, Dorothy observed, arranging cinnamon rolls she'd made at 3 a.m. because insomnia had become her spiritual discipline. The transformation had been gradual, then sudden. Linda noticed at first in small ways. She'd stopped checking her phone compulsively for messages that never came. She'd begun praying in fragments throughout the day instead of formal monologues at night. She'd even stayed for coffee hour the previous Sunday, not performing but actually present. Something's changing in you, Souza observed. You're less careful. Careful was killing me, Linda realized aloud. I was so busy managing everyone's perception of me that I forgot to actually live. Margaret smiled. That soul flowing, taking root. When you stop grinding against reality and start moving with it, when you quit forcing yourself into shapes that don't fit. Is that what this is? Linda asked. Soul flowing. I keep hearing you use that phrase. It's what we discovered by accident, Carla explained. We came for coffee and misery, but we found this rhythm, this way of being that's both structured and free. We show up consistently, but we flow with whatever needs to surface. Like this morning, Dorothy added. I came planning to process anger, but what emerged was gratitude. The practice created space for what needed to flow, not what I planned to discuss. Linda understood. The 5 a.m. gatherings had become a container strong enough to hold chaos, safe enough for truth, consistent enough to trust. She'd learned to flow between tears and laughter, doubt and faith, anger and acceptance, sometimes all in one morning. Yesterday, Linda shared, I was in the grocery store and ran into Barbara Thompson. Usually, I'd give her my blessed answer and escape. But instead, I told her I'd been struggling and found help. She nearly dropped her cantaloupe. You broke the Christian woman code, Susan laughed, admitting struggle in the produce section. Revolutionary. She asked if she could come tomorrow, Linda continued. I didn't know if. Yes, Margaret said immediately. The table extends. That's how flowing works. It doesn't stay contained. It spreads to whoever's thirsty enough to show up at dawn. The clock read 5:43. Outside, the world was waking. Inside, 5 women had discovered that the secret to spiritual survival after 50 wasn't more programs or better theology. It was this, showing up in the dark, telling the truth, and letting their souls flow together toward light. Barbara Thompson arrived at 4:58 a.m., looking like she'd been crying since midnight. Her usual church polish was gone, hair on, makeup from yesterday streaking her cheeks, wearing her husband's old flannel over pajama pants. I don't know why I'm here, she said at the door. That's the only requirement, Margaret responded, guiding her inside. Linda watched Barbara's carefully maintained facade crumble at the side of the kitchen table. No judgment, no fixing, just space. This was what she'd learned in 3 weeks. Gentle community had its own power, different from aggressive evangelism or intensive discipleship. It was like water on hard ground, seeping slowly until something could grow. Barbara sat and immediately began apologizing. I shouldn't complain. I have a good life. My husband's wonderful. My kids are successful. I just... Stop, Dorothy interrupted kindly. We don't rank pain here. Loneliness is loneliness. Whether you're widowed or married to someone who can't see your soul, the permission broke something open in Barbara. He's wonderful, she repeated, then whispered, but he hasn't asked me a real question in 15 years. We share a house, a bed, a life, but I'm dying of invisibility in my own marriage. No one rushed to defend the institution of marriage or offer 5 steps to better communication. They just witnessed Barbara discovering she could say This was the power Linda had been experiencing, not advice, not answers, not accountability in the traditional church sense. Just presence without pressure. The gentle community created space for truth to emerge naturally, like plants growing toward light when given room. I've been married 37 years, Susan shared, the last 10 to a man whose mind is slowly leaving. Some days he knows me, some days I'm a kind stranger. The loneliness of being forgotten by someone who promised to remember you forever, there's no Hallmark card for that. Carla added softly, we're taught that Christian community means potlucks and prayer chains. But this seeing and being seen without pretense, this is what Christ meant by where 2 or 3 are gathered. The gentleness had structure though. Linda had learned the rhythm. Arrive, settle, share what's real, listen without fixing, flow with what emerges, leave carrying each other's truth. No one dominated, no one fixed, no one performed wisdom they didn't possess. How is this so different from small group? Barbara asked. Small groups have curriculum, Margaret explained. We have presence, small groups pursue answers. We make space for questions. Small groups often become performance venues for spiritual achievement. We're more like spiritual hospice. We're learning to let things die that need to die so new things can be born. That sounds terrifying, Barbara admitted. It is, Linda confirmed. I've been dying to my performance for 3 weeks, but something real is growing in its place. Something that flows instead of grinds. Barbara looked around the table. Can I come back tomorrow? 5 voices answered in unison. 4:55. Week 4 brought rain and revelation. Linda arrived soaked, despite her umbrella, finding the kitchen unusually quiet. Barbara was there, her second week now, along with the original 4. But today Dorothy sat in stillness. Her usual gentle energy contracted into something dense. My granddaughter's scan, she said simply. The cancer spread. In Linda's previous life, this would have triggered an avalanche of fixing promises to pray, declarations of God's sovereignty, testimonies of miraculous healings, anything to avoid sitting with the unbearable weight of a child's suffering. But the kitchen table had taught her something revolutionary. Sometimes the holiest response is silence. They sat with Dorothy for 7 minutes without words. Not empty, silenceful silence, pregnant with presence. Linda watched Margaret resist her visible impulse to comfort, watched Susan's hands clench and unclench, watched Carla's eyes fill and overflow. They were all dying to fix this unfixable thing, but they'd learned that fixing was often another form of abandonment. Finally, Dorothy spoke again. Please don't tell me God has a plan. Please don't say she's going to be fine. Please don't minimize this with hope I can't access right now. What do you need? Barbara asked, and Linda recognized the breakthrough. Barbara had stopped knowing the answers. I need to be furious without being corrected. I need to doubt without being evangelized. I need to scream at God without someone defending him. Dorothy's voice cracked. I need people who can sit with me in hell without trying to drag me to heaven before I'm ready. This was the skill they'd been developing without naming it. Listening without fixing, witnessing without rescuing, being present to pain without immediately medicating it with platitudes. It went against every Christian reflex they'd developed, this willingness to let suffering be suffering. When my husband's mind started going, Susan offered. People kept saying, God won't give you more than you can handle. I wanted to throw hymnals at them. God had given me exactly more than I could handle. That was the point. I was handling nothing. I was drowning, and I needed someone to acknowledge the drowning, not throw me theological life preservers that didn't float. Margaret nodded. We're so terrified of unresolved pain that we rush to resolution. But soul flowing means moving with the current of what is, not forcing the current to change. Dorothy, your granddaughter has cancer. It's spreading. You're terrified and furious. That's what's real today. But how do you have faith while acknowledging that? Barbara asked, genuinely confused. Isn't faith believing for the best? Faith is staying present to reality while trusting God is also present, Carla answered. Not that he'll fix it, but that he won't abandon us in it. Sometimes that's all we get, presence, not solutions. Dorothy reached for Linda's hand. 3 months ago, I would have isolated with this news. Pushed through alone, performed strength at church, died inside while smiling outside. But you've taught me something. Carrying unbearable things becomes slightly more bearable when someone else acknowledges the weight. Linda squeezed back, remembering her own unbearable weight just weeks ago. We're not carrying it for you, but we're witnessing you carry it. That's different from being alone. The rain intensified against the windows. 6 women over 50 sat in Margaret's kitchen, practicing the hardest spiritual discipline Linda had ever encountered, letting pain be pain, letting doubt be doubt, letting fury be fury without rushing toward premature resolution. This was listening without fixing. This was love without answers. This was soul flowing through the darkest current together. Week 5 arrived with unexpected sunshine and 7 women. Barbara had brought her sister-in-law Ruth. The table expanded, Margaret somehow producing another chair and mug like loaves and fishes. The rhythm stays the same, Margaret explained to Ruth. But what emerges changes based on who's here. We're learning to flow together, not perform solo. Linda watched the dynamic shift with 7 instead of 6. More voices, more stories, but also something else, a collective intuition developing. They'd begun to sense each other's needs without words, moving like a school of fish responding to invisible currents. This morning, Carla started to speak about her son, then stopped. Without discussion, Dorothy began humming not a hymn, just a wordless melody. One by one, they joined her, creating harmony without plan or practice. Carla cried through the humming, held by sound instead of words. How did you know to do that? Ruth asked when silence returned. We didn't know, Susan answered. We felt. That's what flowing together means, responding to the spirit moving between us, not just in us individually. Linda recognized this as the transformation she'd been experiencing. Her spiritual life had been solitary confinement, just her and God in isolated transaction. But Soul Flowin' was teaching her that faith was meant to be communal, that the Spirit moved between people as much as within them. Yesterday at church, Barbara shared, Pastor preached about the body of Christ. I've heard that sermon 50 times, but sitting here, I finally understand. We're not just individuals who happen to gather, we're becoming something together, something that flows. Like this morning's humming, Marguerite observed. No one led, no one followed. We moved together instinctively. That's what happens when you practice presence consistently. You develop collective intuition. Ruth looked overwhelmed. I spent 40 years in corporate leadership. Everything was strategic, planned, controlled. This terrifies me. Good, Dorothy said gently. Terra means you're at the edge of transformation. Control was your armor. Flow requires nakedness. They spent the next 30 minutes discovering what flowed when 7 souls stopped grinding against life. Stories emerged in organic order. Linda sharing a breakthrough with her estranged sister, Susan celebrating a moment of recognition from her husband, Carla admitting she'd started dating at 61 and felt ridiculous. No one managed the conversation. It managed itself, each woman speaking when the current turned toward her, listening when it turned away. They were learning to read the spiritual atmosphere, to sense when someone needed space, when someone needed touch, when someone needed challenge or comfort. This is church, Ruth whispered, wonder in her voice. This is what church was supposed to be. It's what happens at 5 a.m., Margaret smiled. Before institutional religion wakes up, before programs and politics, just souls flowing together toward something true. The clock read 6:15. They'd gone over time without noticing. 7 women over 50 had discovered that spiritual community wasn't about believing the same things or following the same rules. It was about flowing in the same direction, toward honesty, toward presence, toward the sacred ordinary of dawn and kitchen tables, and the revolutionary act of showing up real. Week 6 brought crises. Linda arrived at 4:45 to find Margaret's house door locked. Panic rose. Margaret was never late, never absent without warning. By 4:55, 5 women clustered on the porch, confused and concerned. Hospital. Margaret's text finally came at 5:03. Jim collapsed, stroke. Don't know anything yet? Jim was Margaret's brother, her only living family. The women looked at each other in the streetlight's glow, momentarily lost without their anchor, their kitchen, their sacred routine. "My house," Linda heard herself say 3 blocks. "I have coffee." Her townhouse wasn't ready for guest dishes in the sink, laundry on the couch, the general disarray of someone who'd stopped pretending even for herself. But at 5:07 a.m., pretense was irrelevant. They crowded into Linda's small kitchen, Barbara making coffee with grounds she found after 3 tries, Dorothy clearing the table of Linda's accumulated mail and loneliness. The space was different, but the intention was the same: show up, tell truth, flow together. "I'm scared," Ruth admitted. "Not just for Margaret. I'm scared how quickly I've come to depend on this. 6 days, and I'm already terrified of losing it." "That's trust," Susan recognized. "You can't lose something you haven't let yourself need." Linda understood. 6 weeks ago, she'd protected herself from disappointment by expecting nothing. Now, she'd allowed herself to need these mornings, these women, this flowing. The vulnerability of trust felt like standing naked in winter wind. Carla's phone buzzed. "Margaret, Jim's stable. Surgery in 2 hours. I can't leave, but knowing you're together helps. Don't wait for me. Flow anyway." "How?" Barbara asked. "She holds the space." "No," Dorothy corrected gently. "We hold it together? Margaret just gave us permission to discover that." So they did. In Linda's cluttered kitchen, with mismatched mugs and grocery store coffee, 7 women discovered that trust wasn't built on perfect conditions or single leaders. It was built in showing up anyway, in flowing despite disruption, in discovering that the practice was stronger than any individual. Linda found herself naturally facilitating, not leading, but creating space for what needed to emerge. The months of loneliness had taught her to recognize isolation in others, to sense when someone was holding back, when someone needed invitation. "Susan," she prompted gently, "you've been quiet." Susan's confession came in fragments. Her husband had remembered her that morning, called her by name, asked about their daughter, then forgot again within minutes. The cruelty of glimpses, the torture of momentary return. They held Susan's pain without fixing, witnessed her grief without platitudes. Trust deepened in the holding, trust that pain could be shared without being minimized, that doubt could be expressed without being corrected, that the flowing would continue even when the river changed course. At 6 o'clock, they stood in Linda's living room, joining hands spontaneously, not planned prayer but organic response to crisis and continuation. 7 women who'd been strangers 6 weeks ago now trusted each other with their unmasked souls. "Tomorrow?" Ruth asked. "Here until Margaret's back," Linda confirmed, surprising herself with the certainty. Same time, same flowing, different address. Trust built before sunrise. Trust in the practice, in each other, in the mysterious current that had brought them together and kept them afloat when their original anchor was suddenly gone. Margaret returned on day 10 of the crisis, Jim recovering but requiring months of rehabilitation. She arrived at Linda's door at 4:50, looking older but somehow more luminous, carrying a bakery box and exhaustion like sacraments. "You kept flowing," she said simply, seeing the women gathered in Linda's kitchen. "The current continued without me." "Not without you," Dorothy cried. "With you, in a different way. You taught us the rhythm. We just kept dancing." They developed something in Margaret's absence, not independence, but interdependence. Linda had discovered she could facilitate without controlling. Barbara had learned to offer comfort without fixing. Ruth had found her voice after decades of corporate silence. The flowing had revealed gifts none of them knew they possessed. "Tell me about the mornings," Margaret requested, settling into Linda's couch like coming home. They shared the evolution, how Linda's kitchen had become sacred space, how they'd started texting throughout the day, not advice or fixes, just witness. "Thinking of you, holding that with you. You're not alone." How? Susan's husband had been hospitalized and 3 women showed up without being asked. How faith had become something they did together rather than believed alone. "This is what I dreamed," Margaret said softly, "but I was too afraid to release control. Jim's stroke forced me to let go, and you all caught what I dropped." "We caught each other," Carla clarified. That's what's different about soul flowing. It's not top-down discipleship or peer pressure, accountability. It's mutual holding. Linda thought about the transformation. 6 weeks ago, her faith had felt like a heavy coat she wore alone in the desert. Necessary, but suffocating. Now faith felt like water she floated in, held by something larger than her own effort. The beliefs hadn't changed, but the container had. Faith was no longer private property, but communal practice. I used to think faith meant certainty, Ruth reflected. Knowing all the answers, never doubting, always strong, but this being held while falling apart. Holding others while they dissolve, this feels more like faith than all my decades of performance. Barbara added, yesterday, someone asked me how I was doing, and I told them the truth. They looked panicked, like I'd broken protocol. But I can't go back to pretending. This group has ruined me for shallow Christianity. They laughed, recognizing themselves in the ruin. Each woman had been dismantled by these morning gatherings, the careful constructions of acceptable Christianity crumbling in the face of raw honesty. But in the demolition, something real had been revealed. I need to tell you all something, Susan said suddenly. I'm putting Tom in memory care. I've been deciding alone for months, but sitting here, being held by you all, I know. It's time. I can't do it anymore. No one questioned her decision. No one offered alternatives. They simply moved closer, physically and spiritually, creating a container strong enough for Susan's grief and relief to coexist. This is faith that feels held. Margaret named it, not faith in outcomes, but faith in presence. Not believing for miracles, but believing in the miracle of showing up, of flowing together through whatever comes. The sun was rising now, painting Linda's modest living room gold. 8 women over 50 had discovered that faith wasn't meant to be carried alone like a cross. It was meant to be shared like bread, like wine, like dawn itself, broken and poured out and received together, holding and held, flowing like grace itself. Week 8 brought December cold and unexpected warmth. Linda stood at her kitchen window at 4:30 a.m., watching snow fall like forgiveness, preparing for what had become the heartbeat of her life. 8 women who'd been strangers in October were now something else entirely. Sister Dorothy had called her yesterday at the grocery store, introducing her to a friend, not church sister, not sister in Christ with that formal distance, just sister, immediate, intimate, true. They arrived in their new formation, no longer knocking, just entering hanging coats with familiarity. Knowing why Linda kept the good mugs, the real cream, the emergency tip. Margaret and Barbara arrived together, having discovered they lived 2 streets apart for 15 years without knowing. Susan brought Ruth, who brought her neighbor, Patricia, 67, new to faith, suspicious of church, but drawn to kitchen tables. 9. Margaret counted, smiling. The table keeps extending. Patricia sat nervously, clutching the coffee mug like an anchor. I'm not sure I belong here. I only started believing 6 months ago. I don't know the Bible. I don't speak Christian. Perfect, Carla laughed. We're unlearning Christian and learning human. You're ahead of us. This was what sisterhood had become, not biological, not institutional, but chosen and cherished. They developed their own language. Flowing meant releasing control. Grinding meant forcing outcomes. Morning truth meant what emerged at 5 a.m. before defenses woke up. Can I tell you something? Barbara asked the group. Yesterday was my wedding anniversary, 38 years. And for the first time, I told my husband I was lonely in our marriage. The room held its breath. He cried. Barbara continued, said he'd been lonely too, but didn't know how to bridge it. We talked until 2 a.m. Really talked. First time in a decade. I couldn't have done that without learning to tell the truth here first. This was the ripple effect Linda had been noticing. The honesty practiced at dawn was infiltrating their days. Susan had started a real conversation with her daughter about anticipatory grief. Carla had stopped apologizing for taking up space. Ruth had admitted to her former colleagues that retirement was harder than she'd expected. We're changing, Dorothy observed. Not just individually, but as a constellation. Each shift affects the whole pattern. Linda thought about her own transformation. 8 weeks ago, she'd been a ghost haunt in her own life, present but not alive, visible but not seen. Now, she had sisters who texted when they noticed her car wasn't at the store, who knew she ate cereal for dinner when depression visited, who called her out when she started performing again. "Remember when we were strangers?" Margaret asked, sitting in the same sanctuary for years, knowing nothing real about each other. "I knew your committee assignments," Susan laughed. "Your husband's name, your public face. But I didn't know you woke at 3 a.m. panicking about insignificant. Didn't know you wrote poetry. Didn't know you were brilliant and broken simultaneously." That's what sisterhood is, Ruth realized. Knowing someone's brilliance and brokenness, loving both, needing both. Patricia had been quiet, absorbing. Finally she spoke. "I avoided Christianity for 6 decades because it seemed fake, performative, exhausting. But this is different. You're all so beautifully wrecked, so honestly reconstructing. Can broken people be sisters? Only broken people can be sisters," Linda answered, remembering her own arrival, terrified and armored. "Wholeness is an illusion that keeps us separate. Brokenness is where the light gets in, where we flow together." 9 women over 50, from strangers to sisters in 8 weeks. Not through programs or studies or structured discipleship, but through the simple revolutionary act of showing up in the dark and telling the truth until love became inevitable. The text came at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday. "Can we have an emergency morning? I can't wait until Thursday." From Ruth. Within minutes, the group chat exploded with yes and what time, and your house or mine. They settled on midnight, technically morning, technically within their covenant of dawn gathering. Linda arrived to find Ruth's house ablaze with lights, coffee already brewing, 5 women already there. By 12:15, all 9 had assembled in pajamas and winter coats, urgency overriding appearance. Ruth stood in her kitchen, holding a letter. "My son called. First time in 3 years. He's getting married. Wants me there. But he has conditions. I can't mention God, can't bring anyone, can't stay with family. I'm allowed to attend if I promise to be invisible." The pain in the room was palpable, every woman understanding the impossible choice between presence and authenticity, between accepting crumbs and maintaining dignity. "I don't need advice," Ruth continued. "I need a safe space to admit that I want to go, even though it will devastate me. I want to see my son even if he's ashamed of me. I'm so tired of being strong about this." This was what they'd become, a safe space for tired souls to stop performing strength. Linda remembered her first morning, how revolutionary it felt to admit exhaustion without immediately being told to lean on Jesus harder, pray more, trust better. "Tired is holy here," Margaret said simply. "Tired of pretending, tired of being strong, tired of carrying things alone. Your soul is tired, Ruth. Let it rest here." They didn't strategize solutions. They didn't quote scripture about forgiveness. They simply created space for Ruth's exhausted soul to exist without performing any emotion, not forgiveness, not anger, not acceptance, just the messy middle where most of life actually lived. Dorothy shared next. "My granddaughter starts chemo Monday. I'm tired of being the faithful grandmother. I want to scream at God until my throat bleeds, but everyone expects me to be the prayer warrior." "Scream here," Susan offered. "We can hold it." And Dorothy did not literally screaming, but speaking words that would horrify their church community. Raw, ugly, honest words about a God who allowed children to suffer. About faith that felt like a straitjacket. About being tired of testimonies where everything worked out. One by one, they laid down their exhaustion. Barbara's marriage improvement requiring constant work. Susan's daily grief as her husband disappeared incrementally. Carla's son's continued silence. Patricia's fear that her new faith would eventually demand the same performance she'd always rejected. "This is what we've created," Linda recognized aloud, "a space where souls can stop grinding, where we don't have to produce hope or manufacture peace or perform healing, where we can just be tired together." "The world offers so many spaces for achievement," Ruth said through tears. "But where do tired souls go? Where do we rest when even our faith feels like work?" Here, 8 voices answered in unison. Here at midnight. Here at dawn. Here when the world's expectations sleep and we can finally stop carrying what was never ours to carry alone. By 2 a.m., they were laughing, the absurd, holy laughter of exhausted women who discovered that admitting defeat was its own victory. Ruth had decided to go to the wedding, not to be invisible, but to be herself. Faithful, beautifully present even in rejection. Safe space for tired souls. That's what Soul Flowing had given them. Not answers, but rest. Not solutions, but witness. Not fixing, but the revolutionary grace of being broken together at midnight. At dawn, whenever souls needed to stop grinding and start flowing towards something gentler than answers. December 15th, 5 a.m. Linda arrived to find Margaret's kitchen full, not just their 9 but 3 new faces. Women from church who'd noticed something shifting in the regular attenders, who'd finally asked what was different, who'd been brave enough to accept the invitation to dawn. But Linda barely noticed the expansion. Today was the anniversary. 8 years since Robert left. 8 years since she'd become invisible. Every year, this date crushed her into powder, and every year she'd endured it alone. We know what today is, Dorothy said simply, as Linda sat down. Linda's breath caught. How? Barbara mentioned the divorce timeline. We did the math. You don't have to talk about it, but you're not alone with it. The tears came immediately, not grief tears, but relief tears. 8 years of December 15th when she'd called in sick to work, hidden from the world, eaten ice cream for breakfast while looking at wedding photos. 8 years of silence so complete it felt like drowning. He left me for someone younger, prettier, less complicated, Linda heard herself saying. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was how everyone at church pretended it hadn't happened. Like I'd simply always been single, like 23 years of marriage just evaporated. Because acknowledging it would mean acknowledging that Christian marriages fail, Susan understood, that good women get left, that following Jesus doesn't guarantee happily ever after. One of the new women, Helen, spoke unexpectedly. My husband left 17 years ago. I've been sitting behind you at church for 8 years, Linda, watching you navigate the same invisibility. I should have reached out. I'm sorry. We all should have, Margaret added. We let politeness override compassion. Let privacy override presence. Linda felt something shift not just in herself, but in the room's atmosphere. The 3 new women were witnessing something they'd never seen in church. Actual confession, actual accountability, actual acknowledgement of communal failure. This is what changes, Patricia named it. When we stop pretending we're not connected, stop acting like individual pain doesn't affect the whole body. They spent the next hour surrounding Linda with stories, not comparisons or competitions, but companions. Each woman who'd been left, betrayed, abandoned, ignored. Sharing not to minimize Linda's pain, but to populate it, to make it less singular. You're not the only one became a refrain. Not the only one whose marriage failed. Not the only one who became invisible. Not the only one who ate cereal for dinner. Not the only one who thought about driving away and never coming back. By 6:30, 12 women over 50 sat in Margaret's kitchen, having discovered that the answer to isolation wasn't independence, it was interdependence. Linda's anniversary was no longer hers, alone to carry. It had become communal property, held and hallowed by women who understood that some dates needed witnesses. Next year, Ruth suggested, we celebrate December 15th differently. Not the divorce, but your survival. 8 years of showing up when you had every reason to disappear. Linda looked around the table, these sisters who'd emerged from strangers. This flowing that had replaced her grinding this morning when she discovered she'd never actually been alone, just unwitnessed. 9 years, she corrected softly. By next December, it'll be 9 years of surviving, but only 1 year of truly living. This year, the year I found you all. The sun rose like an affirmation, painting 12 faces gold. Linda wasn't alone, had never been alone. Had only been waiting for dawn and kitchen tables and the revolutionary grace of women who admitted that faithful people could hurt this much and still be holy. If you're tired of pretending you're not drowning, If you're exhausted from performing connection you don't feel, if your faith has become a beautiful prison, this story is for you. Because somewhere, maybe 3 blocks from your house, another woman is awake at this ungodly hour, feeling the same isolation, ready for the same revolution. Welcome to the 5 a.m. Sisters, where loneliness comes to die and real life begins to flow. Week 10 brought conflict. Linda noticed it first, tension between Patricia, still learning faith's vocabulary, and Helen, who quoted scripture like punctuation. The breaking point came when Patricia admitted she wasn't sure about the virgin birth. That's fundamental, Helen insisted. You can't be Christian without believing that. The room froze. 10 weeks of flow suddenly grinding against theology's sharp edges. Stop, Margaret said quietly but firmly. This is what kills community, making belief a test instead of a journey. Patricia looked ready to flee. This is why I avoided church. There's always a list of things I have to believe perfectly before I belong. Not here, Dorothy intervened. Here, belonging comes first. Belief evolves. Faith flows. But Helen wasn't backing down. There have to be boundaries, standards. Otherwise, what's the difference between this and a social club? Linda felt the familiar panic inflictment. People would leave, community would shatter, she'd be alone again. But then she noticed something. No one was leaving. They were staying in the discomfort, letting tension exist without immediately resolving it. The difference, Susan said carefully, is that we're practicing presence, not doctrine. We're learning to love each other, not convince each other. But what about truth? Helen pressed. Truth is, Cartelis said, Patricia showed up seeking. That's more honest than most of us who showed up knowing everything but feeling nothing. Her questions don't threaten God, Ruth added. I had perfect theology for 60 years, could defend every doctrine, quote, every proof text, but I was dying inside that perfection. Patricia's messy, seeking faith feels more alive than my decades of certainty ever did. This was the test, Linda realized. Could their community hold difference without demanding conformity? Could they flow together while believing differently? Margaret stood, moved to the stove, and began making more coffee. The mundane action broke the intensity. When I started these mornings, I thought we'd all become more alike. Instead, we're becoming more ourselves. Dorothy's doubt, Susan's questions, Patricia's seeking, Helen's certainty, they all belong here. But how? Helen asked, genuinely confused. How do we have community without agreement? The same way the disciples did. Barbara offered gently. Thomas doubted. Peter denied. John believed. They stayed together not because they agreed, but because they were called to the same table. Patricia spoke, voice shaking. I can leave if my questions are too disruptive. I don't want to ruin what you all have. Your questions are what we have. Linda found herself saying, without them, we're just another group of church ladies agreeing with each other. Your seeking keeps us honest. Helen sat quietly, processing. Then, I'm scared. My whole life faith has meant knowing the right answers. If that's not the foundation, what is? This, Margaret gestured around the table, showing up, telling truth, staying present even when we disagree. That's soul flowing, moving together even when we're not in perfect formation. They spent the next hour discovering what community without pressure actually meant. Not agreement, but acceptance. Not conformity, but companionship. Not forced unity, but chosen connection despite differences. Helen and Patricia ended up laughing together over their mutual terror of being wrong. Patricia afraid she didn't believe enough. Helen afraid she believed too rigidly. Both exhausted from trying to get faith right. What if, Ruth suggested, we stopped trying to believe correctly and started trying to love correctly? What if that's the actual gospel? By 6:45, 12 women had discovered that community without pressure didn't mean community without conflict. It meant staying in relationship even when harmony broke, trusting that flow would return if they just kept showing up. Patricia stayed. Eiling stayed. Everyone stayed. Not because they agreed, but because they discovered something rarer than shared belief, shared commitment to each other's becoming, whatever that looked like. Christmas week arrived with Susan in crisis. Tom had been moved to memory care, and she faced the first Christmas alone in 41 years. She arrived at Monday's gathering carrying a grief so heavy the room tilted toward her. "I don't need comfort," she said immediately. "I need practical help. The house feels wrong. I can't figure out Christmas. I don't even know if I should visit him. He doesn't know it's Christmas." Without discussion, the women shifted into action, but gentle action, Linda noticed. Not the aggressive helping that often felt like fixing, but something softer. "What if we just came over?" Dorothy suggested. "Not to decorate or make it festive, just to be in the house with you while you figure out what feels right." By Tuesday afternoon, 7 women were in Susan's living room. Margaret brought soup. Barbara brought wine. Ruth brought nothing but presents. They didn't force Christmas cheer or try to fill Tom's absence. They simply inhabited the space with Susan, making it less empty without making it something it wasn't. "This is different from church help," Susan observed, watching Linda quietly sort through mail that had accumulated. When Tom first got sick, people descended with casseroles and solutions. "This is gentler." Patricia, still new to Faith's expressions, said, "Maybe because we're not trying to fix your grief, we're just trying to be in it with you." This was serving one another gently, not the overwhelming cavalry of crisis response, but the quiet cavalry of continued presence. Helen folded laundry without asking. Carla cleaned the bathroom without announcing it. Dorothy sat beside Susan, saying nothing for an hour. "I learned this from my grandmother," Margaret shared. "When my grandfather died, church people came with their aggressive comfort. But grandmother's sister just came and sat, did small things. Didn't require gratitude or performance. She called it Janelle Servette, helping without heroics." Linda understood. She'd received the heroic help after divorce, the first 2 weeks of overwhelming support followed by absolute silence. But this gentle service was sustainable, humble, almost invisible. "Can we talk about Tom?" Susan asked, suddenly, not about his illness, about him, who he was, who he is somewhere inside still. For the next 2 hours, Susan told stories while the women listened and served. They learned about Tom, the young lawyer, Tom, the father, Tom who built dollhouses for their daughter, Tom who couldn't sing but tried anyway. The serving continued quiet, unobtrusive, gentle, while Susan's stories gave Tom back his personhood. "This is what I needed," Susan realized. "Not to have Christmas fixed, but to have Tom remembered while I figured out how to remember him alone." Ruth had been writing while Susan talked. "I made a list," she said simply, handing it over. "All the things you said about Tom, so you have them when the grief makes you forget." By evening, Susan's house was quietly transformed, not decorated but ordered, not festive but peaceful. 12 women had served without requiring Susan to perform gratitude, helped without needing recognition, given without depleting. "Tomorrow," Susan decided, "I'll visit Tom. Just sit with him. No expectations, just presence." "We'll come if you want," Barbara offered, "or not. Whatever serves you." This was revolutionary, Linda thought. Church taught them to serve aggressively, completely, overwhelmingly, but Soul Flowing was teaching them to serve gently, incrementally, sustainably, to help without heroics, to give without drowning the receiver in obligation. Small acts, quiet presence, gentle service, the kind that didn't exhaust the server or embarrass the served, the kind that flowed naturally between sisters who'd learned that sometimes the smallest gestures carried the most grace. December 28th arrived with unexpected abundance. Linda counted 16 women in Margaret's kitchen, spilling into the living room. Word had spread not through announcement or invitation, but through transformation. Women at church had noticed the change in the original 9 and asked to join the flow. "We need to talk about this," Margaret said after the morning's sharing. "We're growing beyond kitchen tables." "Multiple groups," Barbara suggested. "Different houses, same practice," but something in Linda resisted. That feels like dividing when we've just learned to flow together. Helen, who'd become fiercely protective of their unity despite her early resistance, added, "We're not a program to be replicated, we're a living thing that needs to grow naturally." They spent an hour discovering what they were actually inviting people into. Not a curriculum or system, but a way of being. Not answers, but presence. Not performance, but flow. What if, Ruth proposed, we became like water finding its course? Some mornings here, some mornings in other kitchens, but all flowing from the same source. Patricia, newest to faith, but somehow clearest about its essence, said, "The invitation isn't to our group, it's to the practice. Show up before dawn. Tell the truth. Flow with what emerges. That can happen anywhere." This was the multiplication. Linda hadn't expected, not organizational but organic. Women starting their own kitchen gatherings, connected not by structure but by spirit. The same commitment to pre-dawn honesty, the same resistance to fixing, the same gentle service. "I want to start one in my neighborhood," said Alice, one of the newer arrivals. "3 women on my street are drowning in isolation, but I don't know how to begin." "Begin with your own loneliness," Margaret advised. "Tell them you need morning coffee and honesty. Don't lead. Don't teach, learn together." Linda thought about her journey from October's isolation to December's abundance. How one blue note had cracked open her armored heart. How showing up terrified had led to this 16 women discovering that the secret to spiritual survival wasn't more programs but more presence. "Can we write it down?" someone asked. "The principles, so others can start?" "No," Dorothy said firmly. "The moment we codify it, it dies." This works because it's organic, responsive, alive. Write down practices, not principles. Together they articulated the practices. Show up before the world wakes. Speak what's true, not what's acceptable. Listen without fixing. Serve without performing. Flow with what emerges. Trust the process more than the outcome. "What do we call it?" Alice asked. "When people ask what this is, soul flowing," Susan said simply. "We're learning to flow with God's current instead of grinding against life. Individual streams becoming a river." By 7 a.m., Linda stood in Margaret's doorway watching women disperse to their days, carrying something new. Not membership in an exclusive group, but invitation to a practice. Not answers, but method. Not arrival, but journey. Several pulled her aside. "Thank you for that first morning. For showing up scared, for letting us see you break apart." Linda realized her loneliness had been the gift that cracked, that let light in, that let others in, that started this flow. Her isolation hadn't been pointless, but preparatory, creating the desperation that made her answer a Blue Notes invitation. "Who else is drowning?" she asked Margaret as they cleaned up. "Everyone," Margaret answered. "The question is, who's ready to admit it at 5 a.m.? The invitation was spreading, not through marketing or programs, but through transformed women who couldn't hide their flowing anymore. Kitchen by kitchen, dawn by dawn, the underground river of honest faith was finding its course. January 5th marked 12 weeks since Linda first arrived at Margaret's door. She stood in her bathroom mirror at 4:30 a.m., barely recognizing herself. Same face, same age lines, but something fundamental had shifted. The woman who'd been drowning in October was now teaching others to swim. The morning gathering had evolved again. 3 separate kitchen meetings were happening simultaneously: Margaret's original, Linda's townhouse group, and Alice's neighborhood gathering. They'd discovered that soul flowing wasn't limited by location, but connected by practice. At 5 a.m., Linda's kitchen held 8 women, including 2 who'd driven 30 minutes after hearing about those women who meet before dawn and tell the truth. One was going through divorce at 6. The other had just buried her mother and couldn't find God in the grief. "I don't know if I belong here," the grieving daughter, Carol, admitted. "My faith feels completely gone. I'm angry at God, angry at death, angry at everyone who says mom's in a better place." "Perfect," said Barbara, who'd become Linda's co-facilitator. "Let it flow." Linda watched Carol's shock at the permission. This was what they'd all needed: permission to be human while being Christian, to doubt while believing, to fall apart while being held together. The practice had refined itself through repetition. They began in silence now, letting the night's residue settle. Then someone would speak from the realest place they could access. No one responded immediately. They'd learned to let truth breathe before rushing to touch it. The natural flow, conversation without agenda, wisdom emerging from collective experience rather than individual expertise. "I've been thinking about walking," Ruth said that morning. "How I used to walk alone, fast, focused on destination. Now I walk with others, slower, focused on companionship. That's what's changed. I'm walking together forward instead of racing alone, nowhere." This became the morning's theme: how isolation created urgency without purpose, while community created purpose without urgency. They were all walking together forward now, not towards some goal, but simply forward, together, away from the drowning places they'd inhabited. Susan shared an update. "Tom smiled at me yesterday. Didn't know me, but smiled at my presence. That's enough. You all taught me that, to let enough be enough." Dorothy's granddaughter had responded to treatment. Carla's son had sent a Christmas card, no words, just his signature. But it was contact. Helen had started questioning everything she'd believed, and Patricia had started believing things she'd questioned. "We're all walking different paths," Linda observed, "but in the same direction. Toward truth. Toward flow. Toward each other." At 6:15, they joined hands for what had become their closing ritual, not prayer exactly, but acknowledgement. Each woman spoke one word that captured their morning. Held, seen, breathing, together, forward, flowing, alive, home. Linda's word was grateful. Grateful for loneliness that led to community, for breakdown that led to breakthrough, for the courage of that first terrifying morning. After others left, Margaret appeared at Linda's door. They'd started checking in across locations, weaving the groups together. "3 months ago, you were dying," Margaret said simply. "Now you're leading others to life." "Not leading," Linda corrected. Walking together forward." Margaret smiled. "That's the revolution. Not leaders and followers, but companions. Not hierarchy, but harmony. Not institution, but flow." They stood in Linda's doorway, watching the sun rise over a world that hadn't changed but looked entirely different. 16 women had become 40 across 3 kitchens. 40 women over 50 who'd stopped pretending, stopped grinding, stopped drowning alone. Walking together forward, not knowing the destination, but trusting the companionship. Not having answers, but having each other. The path ahead was uncertain, but the company was sure. Valentine's Day arrived with unexpected celebration. Not romantic love, but something deeper: the love of women who'd saved each other's lives simply by showing up in the dark. Margaret had suggested they gather all 3 groups together, renting the church fellowship hall for a 5 a.m. gathering. 43 women arrived before dawn, carrying coffee and truth and the quiet revolution they'd been living. Linda looked around the room. The same space where she'd performed Connection 12 weeks ago, now filled with authentic community. "We need a name," someone suggested. "For what we've become?" "The 5 a.m. Sisters," Patricia said without hesitation. "That's what my husband calls us, the crazy women who get up at 5 a.m. to save each other." It fit, not because they were biological sisters or sisters in some formal religious sense, but because they'd chosen each other in the darkness, birthed each other into new life through presence and truth. Margaret stood to speak, but not from the circle among them. 12 weeks ago, I was leading from emptiness, trying to save others because I couldn't save myself. Linda's arrival changed that. Her honesty gave me permission to stop performing wisdom I didn't possess. One by one, women shared their transformations. The executive who'd learned to stop controlling, the widow who'd learned to stop hiding, the mother who'd learned her worth wasn't in her children's achievements, the grandmother who'd learned to rage at God and still believe. "What we've discovered," Ruth summarized, "is that the spiritual life we'd been sold private, perfect, performative, was killing us. But this communal, messy, flowing truth is saving us. Linda thought about salvation differently now. Not a one-time transaction, but daily rescue. Every morning, they saved each other from drowning in isolation, from suffocating in pretense, from dying of terminal uniqueness. The 5 a.m. sisters were a rescue squad disguised as a coffee clutch. Dorothy had prepared something. I wrote this down because I needed to see it. She read, "We are the 5 a.m. sisters. We rise before dawn because truth is clearer in darkness. We tell what's real because pretense is exhausting. We flow together because grinding alone was killing us. We are not perfect. We are not fixed. We are not finished. We are just together, and that's enough." That's our manifesto, Barbara laughed. The anti-program, Susan added. "My Tom is goon his mind, not his body. But you all hold his memory with me. You've become the family that remembers with me, that helps me remember who I am, beyond wife, beyond caregiver." Carol, the grieving daughter who'd joined in January, spoke. "I came here faithless. I'm leaving. Not faithful, exactly, but held by faithful people. Maybe that's enough for now." "It's more than enough," Helen assured her. "Being held by faith is sometimes stronger than holding faith yourself." The sun was rising now. Streaming through the windows, Linda had stared through in October, seeing rainbows and empty spaces. But the spaces weren't empty anymore. They were filled with sisters who'd learned that the answer to spiritual loneliness wasn't more of God, but more people who were honest about their need for God. "What's next?" Alice asked. "Tomorrow," Margaret answered. 5 a.m. Someone's kitchen. Truth and coffee. The same thing that saved us, offered to whoever's drowning. Linda stood, feeling the weight and wonder of transformation. "I was the loneliest woman in this room 4 months ago. Now I'm surrounded by sisters who know my worst and stay anyway, who see my doubts and don't fix it, who witness my pain and don't minimize it, who taught me that soul flowing isn't a technique but a way of being honest, present, together." Patricia raised her coffee mug. To the 5 a.m. sisters, to showing up, scared, to flowing instead of grinding, to the holy ordinary grace of kitchen tables and dawn and women who tell the truth. 43 mugs raised in response. 43 women over 50 who'd discovered that the answer to loneliness wasn't independence but interdependence. Not strength but vulnerability. Not answers but presence. Welcome to the 5 a.m. sisters, where loneliness comes to die and life comes to flow. Where faithful women discover that even Jesus needed companionship in Gethsemane. Where the spiritual journey stops being solo and starts being soul-flowing, together, forward, home. The clock showed 6:47 a.m. Time to face the world. But they'd be back tomorrow, and tomorrow, and tomorrow. Different kitchens, same practice, different struggles, same flow in, different women, same sisterhood. Linda walked to her car, no longer alone, never again alone. The 5 a.m. sisters had taken up residence in her soul, their voices a permanent chorus against the silence that had once threatened to swallow her whole. This was just the beginning. It started with one woman, Linda, so lonely she'd forgotten she was real. One blue note tucked in a Bible. One terrifying decision to show up at 5 a.m. and admit she was drowning in plain sight. 12 weeks later, 43 women had discovered that the answer to spiritual loneliness wasn't better theology or stronger faith. It was simpler and harder than that. It was showing up before dawn, before defenses wake up. Telling the truth, even when it contradicts everything church taught you to say. Listening without fixing. Serving without performing. Flowing with what's real instead of forcing what should be. The 5 a.m. sisters on a program you can join or a curriculum you can buy. They're a practice you can start tomorrow. 5 a.m., your kitchen table or someone else's coffee. That's actually good. And this revolutionary commitment to stop pretending, stop grinding against life, stop carrying unbearable things alone. Here's what Linda learned, what Margaret knew, what 43 women discovered together. You're not the only one. Not the only one whose marriage failed or succeeded while feeling empty. Not the only one whose kids don't call or call too much. Not the only one whose faith feels heavy, whose prayers feel like monologues, whose Sunday smile is killing you slowly. Somewhere near you, maybe, in your own congregation. Maybe on your street another woman over 50 is awake right now, exhausted from performing strength she doesn't feel. She needs what you need. Not answers, but presence. Not fixing, but witness. Not programs, but people brave enough to show up real. Soul flowing begins when you stop trying to have enough faith alone and start having honest faith together. When you realize that even Jesus asked his friends to stay awake with him in his darkest hour. When you discover that the body of Christ isn't a metaphor but a lifeline, we literally need each other to survive. If this story stirred something in you, if you recognized yourself in Linda's loneliness or Margaret's leadership or Susan's grief, don't wait for invitation. Become the invitation. Send the text, leave the note, start the conversation. I'm tired of pretending I'm not drowning. Want to meet for coffee at 5 a.m. and tell the truth. The 5 a.m. sisters are waiting for you. They just don't know it yet. They're sitting in their own isolation, thinking they're the only ones, waiting for someone brave enough to admit that faithful women can feel this alone and still be holy. This is your invitation to join the flow. Not someday. Tomorrow. 5 a.m. Come as you are, especially the parts you hide. You're not the only one. You never were. You just needed dawn and kitchen tables and other women brave enough to stop grinding and start flowing. Welcome to the 5 a.m. sisters. Welcome to Soul Flowing. Welcome home. Screen fades to soft dawn light with text. Soul flowing. When you stop grinding against life and start flowing with truth, find your 5 a.m. sisters. The revolution begins at dawn.